Welcome to How to Be a Person, a podcast about life with me, your host, Giuliano Grimaudo. All right, Charlotte, how's it going?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Glad to have you on. How's everything? You said you're in London, right?
Yeah, in London, it's Sunday evening here. It's been a rainy, grey London day today.
Well, I will say I think you are the first guest I've had that's outside the US, I think.
Very cool. Love that. Love that.
Yeah, so I'm glad to have you on.
We've
I
gone
will say,
international.
what was that?
We've gone international.
Yes, we have. So what I'll say is normally on my podcast, part of what I've been doing is just having people on and not really like learning much about them beforehand because I started my podcast and I was inspired to start it from like all the conversations I was having while driving Uber.
Hmm.
And they were all like super organic, obviously no like prepared questions or anything like that, but it was just I just having these fantastic conversations. And so I kind of go into it just like that. Like, okay, we'll just talk and get to know each other's people and see where it goes. What I will say though is that when I saw that like you talk about DEI, I was like, okay, I do really want to talk to you because I think given everything that's going on right now, I feel like it's just like a really good topic to talk
Yeah.
about. So it's not just like, oh, hey, yeah, tell me about yourself. I don't mind. I would like to get to know you a little bit first, maybe before we like get into like the more serious topic. But yeah, I'm definitely excited for this conversation. So
Okay.
before we get into all the DEI stuff, I would like to know a little bit more about you, Charlotte. So whatever you feel like sharing, I want to
Yeah.
hear.
Great. So I'm Charlotte Bidgood. I'm the co-founder of a company called Inclusive People, which I founded last year in June. It's a HR consultancy, so we help people. We help businesses. Just create better places for their people to work. So
Hmm.
that's generally around sort of change management, improving the culture and improving inclusion in businesses. We're generally working with like tech and video games companies because that's my background. Prior to setting up my company, I've got like 15 years experience in HR, maybe a bit more.
Okay.
So that's definitely my background. I have a daughter, so she's 22. So I am mother to a Gen Zer, which is interesting. She's just doing her dissertation in sociology, which is also very interesting. Like I'm very sort of aligned with the inclusion
Mm,
conversation. She's of mixed heritage as well, which is
okay.
interesting as
Okay.
well. And I had her when I was 17, so I was quite a young mom. So I've had quite a journey in terms of being a teen mom in quite hard times to now sort of, having progressed my career and now having my own sort of HR consultancy. So it's been a
Yeah.
journey.
Well, I'm glad you said it, by the way, that you had her when you were young, because I was when you said it, I was gonna be like, you don't look old enough to have a daughter that's that age.
I love it when
Okay.
people say that.
Well, yeah, but I appreciate you giving more context because I was like, maybe I shouldn't say it. Maybe that's rude. I don't know.
I'll take it. I'll take it all as a compliment.
Yeah,
Don't
I guess
worry.
it's a compliment anyway. So
Yeah, so that's pretty much me. So
yeah.
definitely been on a journey. Don't have any like real formal qualifications. So I've spent my
Okay.
like life just learning and growing
Hmm.
and grabbing hold of, role models and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And now like want to do that for other people. So I just started
Yeah.
working with sort of teen mums in the UK, which has been quite interesting. So just
Oh,
helping them,
really?
sort of mentoring them along their path. So yeah, it's a good sort of full circle moment to be able to
Yeah.
help sort of people in a similar circumstance to where I was a few years ago.
Yeah, that's really cool though. Like, are you doing it in sort of like a volunteer way, or do you do coaching or something like that? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I'm a qualified coach, so I do that for my business. But in
Okay.
terms of sort of working with teen mums, that's much more sort of from a volunteering perspective. So just
Mm,
starting out on that journey, so working with a group of mums who come from quite, difficult backgrounds. I
sure.
think harder than probably mine was. I came from sort of like a middle class family, lots of struggle
Okay.
still, but I think sort of, these ladies have had quite difficult backgrounds, and
Mm,
it's really like, how can I show them that there's a different way? Like it doesn't, you can get yourself out of a difficult situation. So it's really
mm,
about sort of mentoring them, helping them with sort of certain skills, and like just
yeah.
making them sort of see like, you don't have to be the, you don't have to be the thing that everyone tells you you're going to be. You haven't ruined your life. Like there's a way sort of through that to improve
Interesting.
yourself. So yeah, it's nice to be able to help sort of, people in a similar circumstance.
Yeah. Are you open to talking more about this? Because I'm actually really interested in it.
Yeah, totally.
So can you tell me a little bit more about your story? Like, I guess, okay, so in high school, like there were a few girls at our school that were pregnant.
Mm.
And, you know, I do remember at the time everyone being like, oh, they're pregnant. That's
Yeah,
crazy. Or
yeah.
like, whatever. I mean, obviously, right. That's just kind
Yeah, of
of, it's
course.
definitely not the norm. But I guess what I'm really curious of, because I mean, obviously this was in high school. This is a long time ago. I don't really
Yeah, yeah,
remember
yeah.
much of it. But also, you know, just thinking about it, I'm interested to hear like what that experience was like how you ended up in that spot and what it
Yeah.
looked like afterwards.
Yeah, of course. So, I was 16. I was kind of I'd had quite some challenges at home. Like my mum had been very unwell, my parents divorced. So there's a
Okay.
lot going on, and I think sort of I was a bit of a wild teen, let's put it like that. And I,
Okay.
met my boyfriend, things happened, and then I was like, oh, I'm pregnant,
Yeah.
and I was very clear like that I wanted to have the child, and
Okay.
that was the right thing for me, but I knew it was going to be turbulent, right? Like there was, my family were fairly middle class. I think sort of the thought was I would go to college, I would go to uni, like just a
Yeah.
normal path. There's a certain expectation. And then I was like, I was at performing arts college, and I was suddenly like, oh, I'm pregnant, and it landed really badly. Family were, devastated. It's going to be awful. You've ruined your life. All of those
Yeah.
things. And, also, my partner was of Afro-Caribbean heritage. My family are white. And, there's also that
Mm,
element of just, conflict. My family are very like, they're very open to everybody, but there's also that sort of thought of like, well, that might be another layer of difficulty.
sure. Yeah, I'll just be
And this
honest.
was
Yeah,
like
it's definitely
20 years
another layer.
ago as well, so there was definitely sort of a sense of, oh God, you've ruined your life. And so the pregnancy was hard, like with sort of trying to convince everybody it's going to be okay. And luckily I sort of got housing, and there was a lot more, I would say, services 20 years ago than there are now. I think there's been so many cutbacks in terms of sort of,
Really?
yeah, definitely. I think, as soon as I had my daughter, well, a year after I had my daughter, as I was under the age of 18, they gave you like full childcare to go back and like re-qualify. So free childcare to then sort of be able
Wow.
to go back and qualify. I don't think that exists anymore. So there was a lot more sort of services at that time, which I just don't think people have access to now, which, you may say is a good thing or you may say is a bad thing. So, that just depends on the
Yeah.
circumstance.
Interesting.
So yeah, so I had her, got housing, and it was difficult, but strangely, as soon as she came along, my family were like, God, she's the most amazing thing ever,
Yeah.
and honestly, from the day that she was born, like she brought like so much joy to my
Yeah.
family. And I
Yeah.
think, there's a picture behind me in my room which says
Mm.
prove them wrong, babe. And that's definitely been my mantra. Like, everyone was like, you've ruined your life, it's all going to be terrible. And my absolute mantra throughout my entire life has been, I'll just prove everybody wrong.
I
So I
love
think
that.
that's a sort of mindset I've always had.
That's amazing. So, so here's what's funny because I'm definitely not like the type of person who's like everyone should get married and have kids and that's the purpose. And like I definitely don't feel that way. I feel
Yeah,
like everyone has a different path. But what I will say is that like just that decision is kind of like a luxury now in comparison to let's say thousands of years ago is what I
yeah,
mean. Like, you know, the human race only exists because everyone was procreating, right?
yeah. Exactly.
So
We wouldn't be here.
yeah, exactly. And so I just mean like from like a basic human standpoint, it's like procreation is just like the foundation of
Yeah,
humanity. That's like the whole reason why all of us are here. And it's the whole
yeah,
reason why anyone's going to be here in the future, right? And
yeah,
so it is funny to see like how people react sometimes. It's like, oh man, your life is over. It's like, what are you talking about? It's
yeah.
it's
This is why
literally
we're here.
this is what happens. This is literally life. Like, and I don't want to say the purpose of life because I don't. There's people who can't have kids. There's people who
Yeah,
don't want kids. That's totally
exactly.
fine. But like to a certain extent, right? It's like this is kind of the
Scientifically,
whole point, right?
yeah, totally, totally. So yeah, it's amazing how it's amazing how quickly people like judge when you want to step out of the norm. But
Hmm.
actually, like I think so many people that have walked a different path have had such success, and I think it's definitely a mindset thing in that. I don't think everybody who has a kid at 16 is going to be like, oh, it's all been amazing.
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
there are sort of there are massive positives to that. You know, me and my daughter, we're best friends. Like, we go on
Yeah.
holiday, we have amazing conversation. She tells me so many things. Like, you know, I'm so proud of her and so proud of myself. And she also, you know, like, she's raised me in a certain way
Mm.
as well. So
Yeah.
there's so many good things to it that I'm so
Yeah.
grateful for.
It's kind of weird to think about because I guess like if you rewind back like a couple hundred years and or even a couple thousand years and like we read stuff where it's like people were having kids at like really really young ages.
Yeah.
I guess all I'm saying about it is that like animals, right?
Mm.
Like they will procreate as soon as their body is mature enough to do so. And so I'm not saying people should be getting pregnant like
No, but
as
like
soon as they're
it's
able
natural.
to do
Like,
so, but I just mean like it's kind of like, well, that's how literally the world operates. That's how
yeah, from a
it all goes, you know?
nature perspective or an evolution perspective, and also, like,
Yeah.
you know, the most unnatural thing, and this is not a judgment, but like, is
Yeah.
actually people having children at 40, 45, which is happening more and
Mm,
more, you know,
so
which
true.
actually like is beautiful, and like people, women are having like this massive careers and then going, oh, you know, I want a
Yeah.
child now, and that's amazing, but actually, you know, that's not really like how the natural order of things
Yeah.
is. So yeah, I just think whatever is right for you is what's right
Yeah.
for you, you
Yeah.
know, which I
Yeah.
think is,
That's how I
yeah,
feel too. It's like it's no judgment either way. I think that is to me is the point. Is like some people will wait until later, and then some people end up have it like you, right? Like have kids like really early.
yeah,
And I think ultimately it kind of just it's like not to be flippant about it, but it doesn't matter.
yeah,
Like it kind of
exactly.
just doesn't matter. It's
Yeah,
one of those things you're
exactly.
like, if it's gonna happen, it can happen anywhere in that range and like whatever it is, just like with everything else in life. It's
Mm,
like you just go with it, right?
yeah,
Like the way it
completely.
happens is the way it happens, you know?
Absolutely.
Well, that's really interesting. And what I'll say too is that, like, okay, so it's easy to compare to like thousands of years ago and like what did people
Mm,
do before and all of that. But then also, right, like we can look and be like, okay, yeah, but there's a lot of things we know, for example, about parenting that like, you know, a teenager is like not really going to be a great parent or like, I'm not going to say like a blanket statement, but
yeah, yeah,
generally
but like,
speaking,
yeah.
right? Even myself, I can sit here and be like, yeah. So my wife is pregnant right now with our first
Oh,
child, and
congratulations.
I'm 33, and so it's kind of like I'm. This is like the quote unquote normal time that
Typical,
people
yeah.
have kids, right? And so I'm looking at it and I'm like, I'm looking forward to being a dad. I think I'm going to be a great dad. But I also look back and I'm like, if I had a kid when I was 18, like I wouldn't, you know what I mean? Like I've learned a lot since then.
But it
And
is
so,
amazing
yeah,
how you can adapt to what you're given. You know, there's been so many
yes.
times when you thought, oh
Ooh,
God, I
good
could
point.
never do that. But you just did it. Like, you know, so I think there is like, as humans, we're so adaptable, you know, like when we're faced with challenge, we generally like step up, you know. So I
Yes.
think, yeah, you may not have perceived that you would be good at it, but actually, you know, like if that was what was handed to you, you'd figure it out, you know, generally.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, that's like what we were saying before. That's life, right? Like
Mm,
whatever happens is you kind of just go with it. Like
yeah,
people always go,
exactly.
I couldn't do that, or I don't know what I would do if this. It's like, well, in the moment you would know what to do.
Yeah.
You would just because everyone does. That's literally what happens.
100%. So yeah, so it's definitely been a journey. And you know, like financially it was difficult to begin with, and then my partner and I split up when my daughter was like 7,
Okay.
which was, you know, wasn't that much harder. I think it just sort of was a change in the situation. But you know, it's sort of like it was difficult financially, but then sort of my career grew, and then we started
Yeah.
taking more holidays and vacations and that kind of thing. So it's been great to sort of grow with her, you know, and sort of show her, you know, I think she's it's difficult because at the beginning I was working crazy hours and I didn't see a great deal of her, you
Mm,
know, and that was difficult. But I talk to her now and I think, you know, like, God, do you feel like you missed out on me being there? And but she's like, no, mum, like, you know, you're such a role model, you're such a strong sort of person who's done so well in your career. So I think, you know, sometimes we feel so bad and so guilty about having to do these things and, you know, sacrifice time with our children to
mm,
pay the bills. But you know what, I think kids, like, you know, they're very forgiving and they're sort of very understanding, you know, or my daughter certainly is, and she,
sure.
you know, she is pleased to have had that sort of role modeling, I think,
Yeah.
which is good, thank goodness.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and ultimately, it's like it's just I keep coming back to it, but it's like you kind of just do. I think this is the thing. Everybody is just kind of doing the best they can with what they have.
Yeah.
And ultimately that's what's always going to happen with your kids too. You have kids, like if you're not able to be there, I'm not saying that it's just like, oh, okay, fine, yeah, who cares, I don't need to spend time with them. I don't mean
Mm.
that, but I mean, like,
No.
if you're in a situation where you feel like, man, I wish I could have spent more time with my kid, guess what, your kid's going to live and they're going to do the best they can with the circumstances they had. Like, that's
Yeah,
just what everyone does, you know?
absolutely.
I keep looking at the sign behind you that you mentioned earlier, prove them wrong. So I just really, really like that because, okay, so I'm writing a book right now called How to Be a Person,
Nice.
and it's the same title as the show,
Yeah,
but
love that.
I'm calling it that because I feel like there are a lot of things that we do as human beings that we just do simply because that's what's the norm,
Hmm.
and there really isn't, whatever, maybe I sound like, real like haughty saying this, but I just feel like there really isn't something that's just like, hey, this is like one thing, like a manual, like here's how to live life.
Yeah,
And so for me, I feel like that's kind of that's what I want to do, is like put together this thing that's just kind of like, here's a good way to live life.
I love that.
um and I'm sure people hearing that be like, there's a ton of self-help books out there, but that's just kind of my take on it. But saying all this to say, I do really feel like part of like the foundation of building a good life is getting clear on what works for you.
Hmm.
And so I really like the whole idea of like prove them wrong, because I think everybody has this idea of like the way things are supposed to be,
Yeah.
and like what you are, like they put limitations on you and what you're capable of and what your
Mm.
life should look like. And so I love that as like kind of just like a mantra,
Yeah.
like prove them wrong.
And I think, like, for me, and this is something that I'm sort of wanting to do more coaching on, is actually like,
Yeah.
your story is your superpower. Your adversity that you faced should be your fuel. Like, don't let
Mm-hmm.
people tell you, like, oh, you're not good enough, or you don't know enough, or, show them that you do. And then, put two fingers up to them once you have, because people can doubt you. And also, like, everybody wants to see, not everybody, that sounds a bit negative, but people love seeing somebody fail. They're like, oh, they didn't
Mm.
make it. Oh, they didn't do that. They also love seeing people win. But,
Yeah.
like, people are quick to go, oh, I didn't think they would, or no, I was pretty sure they would never be able to do that. And it's actually, why is that our sort of first position? Why are we not
Mm.
like, oh, I'm sure with a bit of help and, some consideration, they can make that. And so I think it's really, there's a lot of people that have faced a lot of adversity, a lot more adversity than I have. And I think it's, how do they turn that into like fuel, rather
Mm.
than, thinking, oh, I'm not good enough. I love it when, like, these days, I love it when people underestimate me. I love it
Mm.
when, I tell people I had my daughter young, and then I tell them what I've done and what I do, and they're like, oh wow, like, and I'm like, yeah, like, it's like, I really enjoy that. I sort
Yeah.
of, I find a real sort of, enjoyment from that, because people are very quick to judge, and I think it's sort of,
Mm.
we need to be better at not doing that, and we need to sort of
Oh
almost
yeah.
cheer before we, knock people down, I think,
Yeah.
more.
Well, I think too, I might have talked about this on another episode, but I think that when someone is doing something like that they feel compelled to do, when they're doing what they feel like they were meant to do, and when they're like winning, I think it's just a mirror like on the person to be like, oh, this isn't like, I'm not doing what I feel like I was meant to do. I'm not working towards my
Yeah,
dreams. It's like you're working hard and you're like, here, like you're just like putting a mirror right in their
yeah,
face, and so they feel bad. And this
yeah.
isn't conscious. I think it's happening
And
subconsciously
it's
that
them,
they
it's not you.
realize.
Like, you're just going to do what you're doing. But yeah, you're right.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like, I'm not doing that for like to make you feel that way, but I do think that that's like what's happening in people,
Yeah.
because, and again, this is not a judgment, because I myself, I feel like, have been in this place
Oh yeah,
before, but
we've
I
all
think a
been
lot
there,
of
right? Bit
people,
of envy,
yeah.
or, yeah.
Yes, but like, to me, it's valuable actually when I see someone react like that. In my mind, I actually feel like I've done them a service, because I do think that's what's happening, is they're like being forced to realize like, oh man, I'm not doing
Yeah.
like what I
I
feel
need to
like I
level
was
up.
meant to do, and that person is, and they want to tear you down, like, and bring you down to their level, because then they don't have anybody to compare themselves to,
Yeah.
because then it's like, oh, everyone's at my level. It's not like, oh man, that person's up there in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
um there was something else about that I wanted to say. I don't know, I lost it. But No, I do think it's really valuable. And I think a lot of people live their lives in a way where they're just doing what's expected of them. And again, it's not a judgment, but I do think that like people, like, I think everyone has like something that if they were doing it would just light like a total fire in them. And I think the people who are taking a lot of action, the people who are doing what they feel like they were meant to do, people who are like really like working hard to like build what they like have envisioned in their mind, none of them like they don't judge other people who are doing that.
No, but it is
Right? It's
hard.
always the people who are just living the like base life and they're like, why
Yeah.
are you doing that? Why are you working hard?
Yeah,
Why are
yeah,
you doing
absolutely.
this
When
thing?
you're sort of passionate and you're living the life that you've chosen, then you probably don't have those feelings. But it
Yeah.
is, that's not, it's not easy. It's not when, everyone's going left and you're like, I'm
Mm,
gonna go right. Like it's not an easy thing
so
to
true.
do. And I think sort of, like because you think, oh God, like if it goes wrong, like, will people judge me? It's sort of when I left Activision Blizzard, where I was the senior HR director, so that was my last corporate job. I left because we were purchased by a big organization. I'd made lots
Mm,
of changes, and actually, I decided that I sort of wanted to put my hand up and see if I could leave. So I did, and I sort of exited the company
yeah.
on good terms, but sort of wanted to go with a package. So I did that. And I knew in my heart, like I couldn't go to like another senior HR role. I'd done it for too long. I didn't have a great deal of passion, like to just go and work for another company. I'd worked for really good companies already.
Mm,
And I thought, if I just go and do another job, I'm just going to feel like I'm doing the same job for another company.
yeah.
And it just wasn't like, I wasn't getting out of bed going, God, I love what I do. And I really have had times where I love what I do. I'm so
Yeah.
like career driven. And I thought this just isn't something I can do again. And so I was like, I need to set up my own business. Like I feel like I've learned so much through my career. I've got a lot now to give. And I was like, oh God, my company are not my company. My family are not a family full of entrepreneurs. They're full of
Mm.
people with jobs for life, and we climb the career ladder, and
Yeah.
so it was definitely like a sense of, well, what people are going to think, and like if it doesn't work out, what's going to happen. But you know what? Like, if it doesn't work out, what is the worst that's going to happen? I'm going to maybe lose some money. I'm going to maybe take a little step back in my career if I want to go back into corporate. But I might have got some big new experiences. I might have done something, more exciting for a little while. I might have had a different epiphany of something that I want to do because I've got a bit more
Mm.
space. So I'm not working in that crazy corporate world anymore. So it was hard. And my biggest thing was I was worried about people's judgment of me, not worried about doing it myself, but actually like, what are people going to think? What if it doesn't work? What are they going to say?
Yeah.
So I think it is hard to go against the grain, but I think, as you say, when you're doing that, you're actually happier than the people that are walking the
Mm.
normal line.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's funny. You were saying how when you were gonna go work for another company, you're like, I just can't. Like you were. So this is the thing when you've actually experienced like jumping out of bed in the morning because you're
Oh,
excited about what you're doing, you can't go back to not doing it.
no.
Because as soon as
Yeah.
you realize you're not doing that anymore, you're like, oh shit! Like I gotta find the thing because I've experienced it already. It's like
Yeah.
you won't settle anymore. And I think it's awesome that you were like, okay, I'm not feeling that right now. How do
Definitely.
I get that feeling again? And see, this is the thing about it. Okay. People always want to be logical, right? We always want things to make sense, but
Yeah.
ultimately, like it is a feeling. Like we're always chasing a feeling.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
ultimately, if you are happy, right? If you're happy and you're jumping out of bed every day, like literally what else could you possibly want in your life other than just being
Exactly.
happy? And
And
so
it's
like
like,
if you're chasing the thing that makes you jump out of bed and you're excited to live your life, it's
mm,
like what else could you ask for, you know?
yeah, totally. And I think, my salary is not what it was anymore, because I'm like 6 months into building a business. And there are days when I'm like, God, I don't want to do this anymore. Just give me a salary and like let me just earn the money.
Yeah.
But like I'm so much more creative. I'm meeting amazing people.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, oh, like what could this opportunity bring? Like where could we go with this? I was reading loads of stuff about AI on Friday and coming up with
Mm,
a whole new concept of what we could do. So I think, like it is hard, but there are so many more benefits just to sort of feeling good, and I do
Yeah.
think it will pay off in the long run. But you like being uncomfortable is actually a really happy place for me. Like I'd much rather be a bit uncomfortable than super comfortable. That's where my sort of good
Hmm.
space is, definitely.
That's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about the DEI stuff because that was the whole thing that I saw and I was like, I want to talk to you. So for anybody that's listening that doesn't even know what that term means, can we just start there? Just like explain what DEI is.
Yeah, of course. So DEI can be diversity, equity, and inclusion, or it can be diversity, equality, and inclusion. I think it depends where you're sort of based and sort of which company, what phrase a
Okay.
company takes. Sometimes people put DEIB, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So actually, you feel like you belong to an
Okay.
organization.
Okay.
So in essence, for me, what that is kind of saying, and we're taking it in a corporate sense, so like in a sort
Yes.
of big business, what does that mean? Is
Yes.
really about a business having representation of many different kinds of people. So, if we think about, we call them protected characteristics in the UK. So,
Yeah.
gender, ethnicity, etc.
Yes.
Having a representation of all of those kinds of people, feeling like everybody has an equal sort of say, an equal sense, an equal feeling in the organization, and then actually feeling included. So actually your say matters, you're able to get, close to people that matter, you're able to reach opportunities that exist in the organization, and actually that everybody has sort of an equal sense to some extent, no matter sort of who you are, where you come from, or what you're about.
Okay. Interesting. And so just so I understand what, because, okay, actually, you know what? No, I'm not going to say anything. I have a question.
Mm.
So why is it that DEI is like controversial right now? Again, for somebody who doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's interesting because in the UK, it's a lot less controversial than it is in the US at the
Okay.
moment. So, I mean, my understanding of sort of it's very much driven by US politics at the moment, and kind of let's not get too deep into where things are at the moment, but and I am definitely only an observer of that because I am based
Sure.
in the UK,
Sure.
so we only get what we see. But I think Trump's take on D&I is that it's gone too far, that actually the diversity element, so businesses almost wanting to get such a broad representation of all different kinds of
Hmm.
people, has actually driven the wrong people to be hired, or lesser qualified people to be hired,
Yeah.
potentially for their gender, for their race. My sense
Yeah.
is he's sacked a few people because he feels they're underqualified and were maybe only recruited because of elements of diversity such as race or gender, etc.
Yeah.
And then obviously there's a lot of other people in that conversation, such as Elon Musk and that kind of thing, having an opinion. And he
Yeah.
made a very bold statement about the fact that D&I needs to die. So actually, let's get rid of it. But the interesting thing is, Giuliano, is sort of, I was reading a Forbes article today, and actually it said there's been a surge of searches for companies who have D&I policies, a surge of
Mm.
upwards of 822% of
Mm.
people looking for jobs in companies that still have a clear D&I policy. And actually, Gen Zs are very clear. So I think it's like 56% of Gen Zs would not work for a company that
Mm.
have no diversity, equity, inclusion, because they are so vocal, like as a generation. Gen Zs are so clear about where they stand politically, where they stand in terms of equality, where they
Mm.
stand in terms of sort of people having equal, fairness and right to things. So I think, yes, maybe it has gone too far. And I do think sort of there is definitely a sense here in the UK, and I'm sure in the US, that actually one group of people that were really suffering from actually the force of the diversity, equity, inclusion sort of movement
Okay.
was white men, which I can actually understand. I
Okay.
think sort of, I can understand how it would feel like, oh, we're looking for a woman to fill this board spot, or we're looking somebody, from a different background,
Yeah.
who maybe didn't go to a red brick university or sort of highly regarded university.
Mm.
Um, and so I think there was a sense maybe that it was in trying to be inclusive, it's actually, shunning one group of people, which I think was generally white men. And I do think that that is something which we need to consider. And I do
Okay.
think, sort of talking to a lot of men in the UK, I think there was definitely a sense of, what does this mean for me? Like, am I ever going to get that promotion? And I
Mm,
think sort of it should always be that we consider people's values and what they bring, and their differing I think experience and qualifications are very important.
yeah.
But I think you often hear people say, like, but we want the best hire, we want the right person for the job,
Yeah.
we want the best person.
Yeah.
But what we have to remember is that doesn't just mean the person who's like everybody else in the team. Innovation like really comes when we have a diverse group of opinions, a diverse group of backgrounds. And actually, if you're just hiring somebody who looks like you, has your background, had the same upbringing, comes from the same sort of community,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to get that diversity of thought. So I
Sure.
think the best person for the job is often somebody who may bring something different to
Mm,
that board or that team.
yeah.
And I think that's what people struggle with. But it's a really difficult tension around sort of
Yeah.
not blocking anybody, but also, like, let's just think about what mix we need in our teams. What do we need? Who do we
Mm,
need? But politically, I know it's quite a challenge in the US at the moment. But what I would say
yeah.
is in the UK, it's actually still a very live, we're not struggling in terms of business at all, in terms of like people wanting inclusion support. So
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely not seeing the same impact here as it is in the US yet, which I'm pleased to say, and hopefully it will stay that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And this has always been my stance on political issues is that I feel like there are so many valid points on either side.
Yeah,
And I think it's really hard to, I mean, I- see, this is the thing. I also have a background in marketing, and I understand
mhm,
why, especially in the US, because we just have two parties. It's
yeah,
like it's perfectly set up that like if you want to win, you have to be polarizing, right? And
yeah,
that's just the way. And so I'm that actually frustrates me a lot because it makes me like I look at it and I'm like, that's not how you make decisions in your life. And
yeah,
if it were, like your life would be pretty messed up actually. Like if you were just super extreme with everything in like one way or another and total black and white. And it's like that's just not how life is, you know?
mm,
And so I feel like things are way more complex than like what does my side say about this? Right.
yeah,
Like, oh well, I'm on the
absolutely,
right, so it's this, or I'm on the left, so it's that. Um, because I appreciate you being like objective because your description of it, like that's why I didn't say anything in the beginning because I wanted to hear what you had to say. And I believe what you're saying is like super balanced about it. And it makes sense because the argument on the one side is like, well, we just want the most qualified people. And then on the argument on the other side is like, well, yeah, but like who people are being excluded
yeah.
because of these things that, make them different than everyone else. And I guess here's my question is there a way to kind of like just like a marry it in the middle because this is kind of my perspective on it. I agree that like okay, yes, I want the most qualified person to do the job, but I also like when I hear the idea of well, we want someone from every group represented in our company. I
Mm,
look at that and I'm not saying that I disagree with it, but what I'm saying is that like when you look at the general population, it's kind of like, well, isn't that just like a really small percentage of the population? And
yeah,
wouldn't you expect the makeup? I'm not saying intentionally, but wouldn't you expect the makeup of each company within a country to be similar ratios, right? If you're like, if it's one in
yeah.
100 people are this, then I would assume maybe one in 100 people in the company would be that, as opposed to like, well, we need to hire someone from each category because we want to make sure we have someone from each category. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that is the key. So I think,
Okay.
your population should be representative of your customer base.
Okay.
So for me, if you're selling like a makeup product, for
Uh-huh.
example, and that is quite predominantly female
Sure.
purchased,
Yes.
and your board is all men,
Mm.
you kind of got to think, like, is that the right makeup? I also don't
Yeah.
think it should be all women, because you need a blend. But actually, like, I think you should try and be representative of your customer group.
Your customer
For
base.
example, when like this first came along as a conversation, probably around in the UK, like diversity was probably started to talk about in 2015, 2016, something like
Okay.
that. And I was working for a big retailer at that point in time, and we were looking at how do we drive more ethnic diversity into the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And we were sort of like, we're at this percentage and we want to get to this percentage. But then we decided actually we need to break that down, because actually the South and London's percentage of ethnic diversity is so much higher than that of the North. So actually, say like when we were looking at our Scotland stores, we couldn't recruit like 20% ethnic minority staff into stores in Scotland, because there wasn't even 20% of
They
ethnic
weren't even
minority
there.
people in
Yeah.
the population.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're so right. Like it's sort of, it's not like this shouldn't be like cherry picking. We need one of these and one of
Yeah.
those. Like
Yeah.
we really need to think about, I think starting with what your customer base is
Yeah.
a really good way to look at it. And, you know, if your marketing team doesn't know that, then maybe that's something that they should go and find out.
Sure.
And actually, I think one of the hardest things, though, is actually data on diversity is very hard in the UK. So actually,
Okay.
the only thing that really is caught by our sort of normal data capture as a
Yeah.
company
Yeah. What's
would be
normally?
age and gender usually. We don't do a great deal of like disclosure around ethnic background. We don't, most businesses don't sort of ask people's sexual orientation. We have done in businesses that I've worked in, I've brought in sort of censuses where we've been interested, you know, totally anonymous, but trying to understand the population, which is
Yeah.
a good way to do it, because then, you know, like, you know your population better, and you know where you might need to make adjustments for people, where actually there might need to be more training on things, where actually we might be celebrating, you know, Christian holidays, but actually like there much be maybe a much higher Muslim population, therefore we should be thinking about how do we sort of celebrate Ramadan, for example. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
understanding a population to be able to celebrate it and, you know, create more belonging and sort of inclusion is very important. But you're right, I don't think we should be cherry picking inclusion. Actually, no, like trust me, I've spoken to my daughter, like she's a
Yeah.
mixed race individual, and, you know,
Yeah.
somebody that is my, you know, the closest to my heart, and I've spoken to her about this, and she said
Yeah.
there is no way that I would want to be selected for a job on the color of my skin rather than the merit that I bring. So,
Good
you know,
point.
and she's just one person, but she's a Gen
Yeah.
Zer, and she's
Yeah.
a mixed race individual, and she's a
Yeah.
woman. So I think she, you know, she has a good opinion. But
Yeah.
I know if I spoke to many other people, the thought of, you know, being a woman and being selected for a board role just because I was then the only woman on the board, just nobody wants that. Let's be real.
Sure.
So there's a
Sure.
real fine balance here, and it is a difficult
Hmm.
subject. But I think, you know, what employers should do, I think, is talk to their people. Like, what do
Yeah.
they want? What would be
Yeah.
valuable to them? How can we make this a more inclusive business? Your team hold the key, so talk to them. That would be my sort of suggestion for companies.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny you say that because that's kind of what was going through my head. Like, well, so first of all, the thing that your daughter mentioned, it's almost like the way it seems is almost like a like reverse racism or reverse sexism or reverse ableism, right? Where it's like, oh, we're choosing you because of this
Yeah, it's
thing,
like the
and
pity
it's like,
party. Like,
isn't
take
this
it.
this? But isn't this the same thing? Like, this is the same thing, just the opposite. It's like,
Yeah,
oh, we're choosing you for this reason, or we're not choosing you for this reason. I
yeah,
think the goal is to just eliminate that from the decision making, correct?
yeah,
So okay, so that's kind of, so that's why I said I appreciate what you said about like companies just see. Look, I'm not an expert in this, and I maybe am coming from a very ignorant place. I don't know, and obviously I'm a white man, right? So people are probably like, who cares what you have to say? But
and do you know why I care, Giuliano? I
sure, well,
care because white men are generally the biggest decision makers out there, and
mm,
actually we need them to care. Like
mm,
they are often the biggest decision makers in the biggest corporations, and actually like your voice matters. And, you know, unless those people start to care, start to get it, start to open up to bigger conversations,
mm-hmm,
removing their own biases, nothing will move forward. When we have like
yeah,
these International Women's Day celebrations and there's just women there, that's not it.
mm,
Like we need
yeah,
men to be allies.
yeah,
We need them to want to be part of the conversation. So the more we say, oh, it's not about you, it's about
yeah.
us. That's the worst thing that we could do.
Good point. Good point. You know, I think my perspective on it is, since you said that you'd like to hear my perspective,
Of course, go for
I'll
it.
share it. It's part of the reason why I liked what you said about like educating their employees, because when you look at it, see, this is what's so funny. Remember before I was talking about like rules, like logic
Hmm.
versus emotion? I
Yeah.
feel like it's the same thing here. Okay. Like we tend to be like, well, we want to be logical. We've got to have at least this many people from this protected group and this many from this. And I think that is part of the reason why there is like a resistance to it,
Hmm.
because it is this kind of like it's a requirement and it's like a rule, as
Yeah.
opposed to, see, okay, this is right when you were saying before about like, oh, I think the argument on the other side is like, well, we just want the most qualified person.
Hmm.
And I think what's funny is that I do think on the other side it's the same. It's like we just don't want these things about the person to get in the way of whether or not you determine that they're the most qualified.
Yeah.
And ultimately, see, this is the thing, is that I think there's a belief that if we put these rules in place, or that this is the like the policy, or like these specific numbers or something like that, it's like, great, then we can prevent, these outcomes that we don't want. But
Hmm.
ultimately, the way to prevent those outcomes is by changing the thought process of the people who are making the
Yeah.
decisions, because the people who are for DEI don't need the rules to tell them this, right? They
Yeah.
would talk to somebody and not judge them based
Yeah.
on those things.
Hmm.
So it's just, I don't know. I do think it's very interesting, because I really feel, this is what I was saying before about things being polarizing. I
Mm.
actually feel like most people are in this, like in total agreement on this, but
Yes.
because the conversation is happening on either end, it seems
It's
like everyone's against each
feeling,
other.
yeah.
Ultimately, everyone wants the most qualified people in the role, regardless of any of the things that we mentioned.
Yeah, but I think the interesting thing is the most qualified, because I don't know if that is the right thing.
Okay.
I think what you want is the best team. So actually, if you like,
Mm,
let's say you had a corporate team, and we call them red brick universities here in the UK, like the most prestigious universities, like in the
sure.
US, like Oxford, Cambridge, that kind of thing. I don't know what you call them in the US, like Brown, Harvard, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah,
Um,
like Ivy League or
Ivy
something
League,
like
yeah,
that.
there you
Yeah.
go. So I think, if you had a corporate organization that had a board of all men, let's say all of a white middle class background, all gone to Ivy League universities, and that was your board, and then one of them left, you know, the most qualified person for that gap
Mm,
may be somebody who is an
yeah.
Ivy League background
Yeah.
or
Interesting.
Ivy League, career. That might be the most qualified, and it might
Mm,
be, and all of those people may, let's say, it's banking industry, they all
yeah.
may have banking background. So you might say, well, the most qualified is somebody with the longest banking
Mm,
background. So that means they're probably, slightly older, and they have a Ivy League degree, and they have a solid career in the banking environment. However, in this day and age, I don't know if that is the most qualified person. The most qualified person might be somebody who comes from a fintech or an AI background,
mm,
and who maybe wasn't qualified in AI at an Ivy League school, for
yeah.
example, because
Yeah.
there wasn't AI in that time. So
Sure.
actually, like, the blend is the most important thing. So
That's a
you
great
don't
point.
want another Ivy Leaguer. You don't want another banking background person. You probably want somebody who comes from a different industry to bring something new to that team, and maybe with a different, career journey that they've gone on. So for
Mm,
me, it's like, when you get a gap, think differently. Don't just think we want one of us. Think, what
mm,
would blend better? What would make this team different? What would bring a different, fresh, new, innovative perspective that we
yeah.
don't already have? So I don't
Yeah.
think it's the most qualified. I think it's, what are we, when we look at ourselves as a board or a
Mm,
leadership team, whatever, what are we missing and what would be new and different to bring in? So I think
yeah.
that's what I would sort of say, because I think there's so much bias of like familiarity. Like, we want
Sure.
somebody that
Sure.
like is like us. We want somebody like the last person. But what you've always had is not what you'll need. Like, I read a stat in, I think it was Forbes, maybe,
Okay.
and it said by 2030, 70% of jobs will see significant change. So I think what every company should be thinking is like, what don't we have and what might we need, because
Mm,
it's not what we've always had, because everything is shifting and moving so
yeah.
dramatically and so quickly.
Yeah.
We need to check ourselves and think, what could we need in the future? So yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
it's the most qualified. I think it's the
Yeah.
blend and the mix almost.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that too, because it's a great point. It's like I was saying before, sometimes we want things to be black and white, but really there is a lot of gray in life.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you sharing that, because that is true. Like, and the example you gave is a perfect one. Like, it's not always just about who's the most qualified, but it's more about what is the most effective team, right? It's not like
Yes.
roles are not always, sometimes, right? Sometimes it's like very siloed,
Hmm.
meaning like I'm thinking about like when I used to work at Jimmy John's, right?
Hmm.
It's
Tell
one
me
of
what
those
that
things where
is.
you're
What
like,
is that?
who cares who's, oh, I'm sorry. Jimmy John's is a sandwich shop. I apologize.
Okay. Yeah.
It's
Cool.
like a sandwich shop, and you've got, people in there, right? Just making sandwiches.
Hmm.
It ultimately doesn't matter. You're just looking like, who's going to fill this role. Like, I don't care who it
Yeah.
is,
Exactly.
who
There are
can make a
times when it doesn't
sandwich.
matter.
Yes, but I can also see how there are times where the most qualified person does not necessarily, like, to fill in a gap does not necessarily result in the most effective team. So I can totally understand that. But see,
Yeah.
I think that this brings us back to the point of simply education. I don't know enough, but do you feel like so let's say companies that do have DEI policies in place, does that mean that like in for certain roles they specifically will only be hiring, in this specific case, someone who is a woman or someone who's trans or someone who's XYZ? Is that the case, or is it more like we're making hiring decisions that are informed by our DEI education that we've implemented in our
Yeah,
company?
I mean, so in the UK, we've never had that. So we've
Okay.
never, I mean, there may be businesses that have done that, but we have a thing called positive. You can take positive action, but you can't positively discriminate. So let's say you had
Mm,
two candidates for a job. One of
yeah.
them was man, one of them was a woman. They're both equally qualified,
Sure.
experience fairly equal. You could then say, actually, do you know what? Like a woman would be great on our team, so we don't have that sort of blend, so we're going to take the woman. But you couldn't say, oh, well, she doesn't have nearly as much experience, but we need a woman, so we're going to put her on the team. So
Mm,
that's probably the difference. So in the UK, we've never had it where we can sort of cherry pick almost sort of the
okay.
blend. It very much is about sort of thinking about how can you attract more diverse candidates to a business, what would be
Mm,
attractive to them to come and
yeah.
work for us. How do we retain diversity? Because I think often, like, let's say it's quite a male dominated company, and then you say, well, we need to get more women in, but you don't have a maternity policy. Actually, it feels very masculine sort of dominated, and
Mm,
women just leave. So actually, what are you doing to keep diversity
mm,
once you've got it in? So yeah, we've in the UK we never had such a sort of like,
yeah.
you know, you can't be as precise as like we want
Yeah.
this blend, but I think it's how can businesses be more inclusive
Yeah.
to different diverse candidates for them to want to
Yeah.
come and work there basically.
Do you know if that's also the case in the US?
So my understanding is I think the US could affirmative action I think is the sort of phrase in the US. So I think
Okay.
and don't quote me on this
Yeah,
anybody, but
it's okay.
I think my
Don't quote me. It's just being recorded.
I think in the US there was more of a quota. Like I think they could. I think it started in universities where they could sort of put out schemes for, say, like people of Afro
Mm,
Caribbean descent. So I think they were more polarized about it in the US.
I see. I see.
So I think it's interesting because everyone in the UK goes, oh, they're dropping everything in the US, so we don't have to do it anymore. And what we're saying is, no, I actually think the US were much more sort of um, specific about these
Mm,
schemes and much more specific about sort of um, lasering in on sort of certain types of
yeah.
diversity, at
Yeah.
uni, like drives and, careers drives and that kind of thing. But in the UK, we've never been able to be like that. We can only
Yeah.
do positive action. We can't positively
Interesting.
discriminate against people. So
Yeah.
I think it was a bit more polarized in the US, and I think that is what Trump's stance is. Like we've gone
Yeah.
too far.
Yeah.
So
Do you
I
believe that that's the case? That do you believe that if it is that the case in the US that it is more specific in that way, do you feel like that is too far? or not?
I think to go back to the looking at my daughter, if she was
Uh-huh.
to get onto a great
Mm,
uni scheme in the US because of the color of her skin, I don't think that would make her feel good. So I think my stance would probably be, if that is the case, then
yeah.
I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah.
I think sort of people want to be seen as the
Yeah.
great person that they are,
Yeah.
and for people not to use the like unconscious bias that I think a lot of people have. They're not like me. Maybe they're not as good as me.
Yeah.
I don't know that they would have had the same life experience and therefore might not be able to do what I need them to do. So I think it's,
Mm,
people kind of taking, getting rid of those biases and those old stories and the stereotypes that they might have had and just taking people like on their own merit, I think is the
yeah.
most important thing. So I sort of feel like the US has gone a bit further than the UK and is trying to
Okay.
pull back. And I was really worried actually, sort of when all of this stuff came out, I was thinking, is the UK going to go, oh, we don't have to do this anymore? But
Mm,
actually, I think what we realise is actually we are probably where we should be, and
yeah,
actually the US is
exactly.
maybe kind of coming back in line. So what we're
Yeah.
having to do in the UK is educate people to say, you know what, the US is dropping a lot of stuff, but actually they were going much further than we were. And actually, I think
Yeah.
on balance, we're in the right place with what we're doing, and we are making progress. We're definitely seeing diversity progress in many places, not everywhere. Let's be
Yeah.
real. But yeah, so I think they are different. I think
Yeah.
the sort of starting place of the US was much more intentional than maybe we've been in the UK.
I see. I see. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you saying that because I mean, I've said this a lot, but I really do feel like most people are good. I believe, well, actually, I believe all people are good. That's a conversation for another time, but
Yeah,
inherently speaking, that
I
I believe
agree.
that they're good. And I also think most people, politically speaking, are not all the way on one side. I think
Mhm.
most people do kind of fall somewhere in the middle, but they force you to pick a side, right? You got
Yeah,
to
that you're
pick right or
forced to make
left.
that decision. Yeah, I watched
So,
a
but
lot of
I,
videos before the election, and it was like
yeah,
Kamala or Trump, Kamala or Trump, and it was
mm,
like I wanted to hear more why people, but it was like make a decision, like choose a name. Like, but you're
exactly,
right, it's like
exactly.
there's a story behind why you had to go to one side or the other.
Hmm. Yeah. So I appreciate what you're saying because I do feel like what you're saying makes sense. And it feels like it's pretty much like most people would be like, oh, yeah, I get that. Because it
Mm.
really just kind of comes down to, I feel like what you're describing in the UK is what I was saying before, where it's just kind of like, how do we educate the people that work for us to think differently about hiring, and how do we like work against some of the maybe unconscious biases we have in our hiring process? Is that
Yeah,
correct to say that?
definitely. And I think the biggest thing for me is like, how do we help decision makers
Yeah.
get rid of some of that bias?
Yeah,
Because,
exactly.
like there are a lot of senior leaders who have wives and daughters and
Yeah.
have very amazing, let's just take gender for example, because it's probably the most obvious
Sure.
one,
Sure.
like around them who they value every day. And actually,
Yeah.
like, how do we get some of those decision makers to see women in the workplace as valuable as
Mm,
the people that help them make decisions in their lives? So I think
yeah.
really educating senior leaders around their own biases is one of the biggest things that I think we need to do. And one of the things that we're working on very much with UK businesses around sort of just dissolving some of that bias is International Women's Day on the 8th of March. So we're doing a lot of
Okay.
work around that.
Yeah.
And so much of the work that we're doing is really like helping people just kind of see their own biases, and also see like, and my experience as a white woman is not the same as a, let's say Afro-Caribbean descent, non-able woman. Like, everyone has a different experience. So I think it's kind of just helping people, get rid of some of those stereotypes that they've got in their mind, particularly decision makers.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I don't know how familiar you are with the decisions and the things that Trump is doing, and I'm not saying that from a place that I don't really know. But do you feel like now they're going too far back in the other direction? Like, because it doesn't appear from what I understand that they're just kind of like pulling back to where the UK is at. It feels like they're just like screw all of this and just get rid of it all. Do you feel, is that the
Yeah,
impression you're getting as
I
well?
do think it's going too far. I think, I think there's a lot in people power, and I think, there is a whole generation of people that are more powerful than you and I, which I'm assuming you're probably a bit of a millennial like me. Do you know?
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe on the cusp. I don't know,
Yeah.
of the younger end of that.
Sure.
But Gen Zs are a very, very, very powerful group of people, and they are the
Hmm.
next group of people that will come
Yeah.
into the workforce. They have a
Yeah.
totally different approach to work than we do. They're not desperate to climb the corporate ladder.
Hmm.
They are not going to do as much of the like profiling and we're here and we'll do it whatever hours you want for us to take the jobs that you want, which I think
Mm.
millennials have done, right? We're like, yeah,
Sure.
we'll
Sure.
talk, we'll answer questions, we'll work hard. I think Gen Zs are just not that, and they all take a very clear stance on TikTok, on viral posting. Like they all have not all of them, like this is scathing, but as a
Sure.
generation, I think they have really like strong opinions of you know the politics and the world in its whole. So I think Trump may have a clear stance, but I think there's a lot to be said for people power these days. And I think, like I said, those numbers of people looking for companies that still have D&I policies, and people that won't go and work for companies that don't still have those kind of policies. So,
Yeah.
but I think the media is really like making it very extreme. It's like in the UK, you'll see, like we saw BT, which is one of our biggest telecoms companies, pulled D&I. When you read the detail, they're actually just pulling like their targets and their quotas. They're kind of
Yeah.
keeping the educational piece, they're keeping the sort of
Yeah.
developmental piece, but they're just pulling some of like the more
Yeah.
like target driven stuff, which what, I think that's okay. I don't think that's a problem. So I think the media makes it so much worse than it is, but
Yeah.
I do think sort of Trump may feel all of those things, but I would like to see that Gen Z could show him that actually they still want these things and that's still important. But you know, time will tell.
Yeah.
Time will tell. But I do. I heard some stuff around him like sacking a few people, sort of in the government recently due to the color of their skin or their gender, and maybe thinking they're not qualified and were only given
Mm.
those things because of those characteristics. I would love that to have been a bit more sense checked, than for him just to have pulled that back, because I'm sure those
Sure.
people went through rigorous interview processes to get those jobs.
Sure.
So I think that's quite sad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's the exact thing that we're talking about. Like it's like we don't want it to go in one direction. Like you don't want to make a decision in either direction because of one of those categories, right? You're like, I
Yeah.
just want to be able to make an objective decision.
Yeah, exactly,
Um,
exactly. But I think, the world's a diverse place. Like, we
yeah,
need to have diverse businesses, diverse
yeah,
products,
yeah,
like we need to be representative of the people that are buying things. And
sure.
that would be my suggestion to any business. It's like, look at your customer base and make sure your employee base is similar to that.
Yeah, it's really tough because I look at it from a perspective too, where because even with that, okay, so I'm not saying I disagree with you,
Yeah, yeah.
but even with that, right? Let's say that there was, you know, because I feel like there's plenty of businesses like this. Like, let's say there was like a hair care company that was specifically targeted towards, like women of color,
Mhm.
and a white, like let's say me, a white guy is totally qualified for a position, and I'm like, oh, I love what you guys do, and blah blah blah, but they're like, well, this guy doesn't really fit our demographic and XYZ. Like, I, you know what I mean? Like, I know that I'm saying this, so like, oh, I wouldn't like that. And it's kind of like, well, what do you think is happening to these other people on the other side of it? I get that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I understand because that's kind of what's happening, right? For these
Yeah.
other people, I'm trying to put myself in that situation,
Yeah, of
and I
course.
don't, and I don't like it. But that's the whole point, right? Is that like we're trying to like prevent decisions being made based on that, but the only way to do so is to talk about it, right? The only way
Yeah.
is to like become aware of it, because if you're not aware of it, then you're probably are making some decisions based on that without realizing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And but like let's say that was the case, and you said your marketing. Let's say they wanted a new marketing
Sure.
head of
Sure.
marketing. Like, would you be the best person for the job?
Maybe. Yeah, exact.
Do you
Good
know what I
point.
mean?
Maybe
Like,
not. Maybe not.
maybe you would, because let's say you'd worked in, products and, hair care,
Hmm.
lots of different kinds of hair care, not specifically for women of color, then you may totally be, because you've got great experience in a broader sense of that sort of product set. But say you didn't have that and you'd been a marketeer in, I don't know, general merchandise like food, that kind of thing, then
Yeah.
maybe you're just not the right person for that job, and that's okay.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. See, and I like talking about these scenarios because you have a different perspective. I feel like you're bringing like little points that I'm not thinking of. So I appreciate it. Like, okay, so let's go along with that same scenario. Let's say I own a marketing agency and I
Hmm.
go and I've got plenty of experience in, marketing to people of color and like with hair care style, like, all of that stuff. Okay. Let's
Yeah,
say, obviously I don't, because I don't even know how to talk about it.
let's
Right?
do this.
Let's say I do. Okay. But then there's a marketing agency that it's owned by someone of color and obviously they have experience in it. They're fine. Like, I don't see it being outside the realm of possibility that the business owner who's deciding between the two would say, well, I would like to support a black owned business, right?
Mhm.
Or a person of color owned business. Like, that's been said before. And so it's
Yeah,
like they would choose it based on that. It's like, well, it feels like the same thing. And this is not me coming from a place of like white versus black or anything like that. You could take me out of the equation. Let's use
yeah, yeah. No, I get it.
any other example besides a white man. Okay. But
Yeah.
like to choose and say, well, I would rather give my business to this because of this reason. That is essentially the same thing, right?
It is and it isn't. And I think there's this question around, can, and this is controversial, but I'm going to say it.
No, go ahead.
Does racism exist the other way? So to the majority, so to white people, which are the majority,
Yeah.
does it exist? Is it a thing? If you are the majority, is it wrong for the minority to want to support the minority? Because actually the majority is supported anyway.
Good
And
point. Yeah. Great
in
point.
my own experience, and this is my very personal opinion, actually, sorry, not experience, my own, in my opinion, I don't think that is a bad thing. I think sometimes we need to make space for the minority, and I think that's like where, I've spoken about white men a few times, but I think white men have felt a bit shunned at times. But actually, they've never felt that in the whole of history. White men have never felt that before because they have always been the patriarchal majority.
Sure.
And, men have generally been the most powerful sex, let's say, powerful gender. Sex, not gender, sorry, we'll get into those different terms.
I know.
But in my own opinion, I don't think it's bad to make space for minorities because they
Okay.
haven't had enough space in the past.
Okay.
So I think that's where I would say it differs, but a lot of people would disagree with me, and
No,
that
no,
is
but I
right.
love that you said that because I don't disagree.
Mm,
Let's take it out of white man owned agency. Let's say trans woman owned marketing
mhm.
agency, person of color owned marketing agency. And then they choosing person of color because they're like, well, I don't know how to say it other than like we're the same, right? I want to give my
Yeah.
business to them. How do you feel about that?
So I would say if they were both offering the same thing
Mm-hmm.
and it was a product for women of color and the white trans marketing agency didn't have that experience, then you have to choose, and you have to choose the one that has the most experience, and
But
that would.
if they had the same experience,
But would they? Because if one of them was actually a living,
okay,
breathing customer, and one
I
of
mean,
them
you're
wasn't,
right. I'm not saying
my
you're wrong. I'm not saying you're
yeah.
wrong. I'm
So
just, it's
my
a
so
good
my
point.
sense would be that the experience wasn't the same because those
Mm,
people that work in the agency have the lived experience. They are
yeah,
the customer.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I think sometimes it just has to come down to what is that point of difference. And for me, that
yeah.
would be it. But
That does,
there
it
is,
makes sense though. I mean, I get what you're saying, and I don't disagree with you. I think that makes
yeah,
sense.
but it
It
is
really
that
does make
like
sense.
it's always grey and like there isn't a right and wrong, but I think
Yeah,
you have
yeah,
what you have to be able to do is explain why and actually sort of have a grounding and some thought process around why you've made that. And playing this situation through has been great because actually it's made me think, oh, like what would I do? And I
yeah,
think in
yeah.
that last example, I'd be like, well, actually, you both had experience of working with a similar product, but actually, you are the
You
customer.
are the customer. Yeah.
I'm choosing them. Like I'm
You're
choosing
right. You're right.
them.
You're
You know?
100% right. You're
Yeah.
100% right. I understand it. Okay, so I will say, because you mentioned this a couple times of like people Googling what companies still have DEI policies. I will play devil's advocate there and wonder if there's people who are like looking it up so they don't support those companies because that does not, it would not surprise me if that was the case. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that explains it, but it also could be part of the explanation.
But I think I
Um,
think you will see that.
yeah,
I think you'll see some. I mean, To be honest, I would like to see some of these companies realize that they, in the long run, are losing talent pools because they're losing their D&I policy.
Mm,
Like there's a big group of people that are not heterosexual, white,
yeah.
Christian, in the US and the UK. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that don't fit that sort of very standard stereotype. And therefore I'd like to see, it sounds bad, I'd like to see some of these companies struggle. I'd like to see some of them
Sure.
realize that actually like
Yeah.
it's important to have that policy.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So just to clarify, what I'm saying is I could see someone, and I'm going somewhere with this, but I could see someone looking up who still has DEI policies because I'm not going to support that business because they still have DEI policies.
Oh, okay. So the
That's what
other
I'm
way.
saying. And so
Yeah.
I'm not saying I agree.
Mm,
I do think that people should vote with their wallets, right, for
mm.
what they believe in. Okay. But all I was saying is that I could see part of that surge in search results being people from who
Yeah.
disagree with it, wanting to
But
know
like
who not to support.
why would you not like
I'm just saying I could see that.
yeah, well,
Just like you're saying, right?
yeah.
You're like, well, I do think those companies should struggle a little bit because of what you believe is different, right? And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that you're wrong, but I'm saying that's ultimately that's how people on the other side would feel.
Yeah.
Because of what I believe, I think that company should struggle, right?
Yeah.
It's the same case,
Yeah.
essentially the
No,
same stance.
it works both ways. But I suppose one of them is actually saying we only want some people. And the other way, where they still have a D&I policy, is we want everybody to win.
Okay,
So
so this
I
this
don't,
is why I brought this up though. This is
yeah.
why I mentioned this is
Sorry.
because I really man, this is what I was talking about, the polarizing stuff. Okay.
Mm,
So if you say DEI, you just say the words DEI, like immediately someone on this side has an opinion and someone on this side has an opinion, regardless of this conversation we're having right now.
yeah.
Right. Like for me, I'm like, I just want to hear what you have to say so I can understand. Right. And
Yeah.
that's like how this conversation is going. But there are people, regardless of whether or not because I will say going into this, I feel like I didn't understand everything. That's why I was asking you questions. And
Mm,
now that I do understand, I'm like, wait, I feel like everyone basically wants the same thing here. Why is it that we have people on either side? So it's frustrating, like with politics, the way it puts people like and separates them on either side, because I think ultimately everybody wants the same thing. And I'm
yeah.
not saying, because I know before you're like, well, but it's not always about the most qualified person. I agree with that. And I
Mm,
think any reasonable person would also agree with that.
yeah.
With the example you gave of like, just because one person in one role is the quote unquote most qualified in a silo doesn't make our team the most qualified by putting that person in that role. I think any reasonable person could hear that argument and be like, I totally get what you're
Yeah.
saying. You understand? And so what I mean is that like, it's so frustrating because now like, this is my opinion, if DEI
Mm,
wants to continue to like have, I say DEI, anybody who supports DEI wants to continue to have this positive impact, I feel like it needs to be rebranded because like politics has put it in the gutter. And so
yeah.
everyone goes, oh, DEI, oh, you're pro DEI, I'm against DEI, or
Yeah.
vice
Yeah.
versa, whatever it might be. And
A
yeah,
rebrand is
that's all I'm saying.
totally what it needs. So I think we'll see it move to more inclusion or belonging. I think they're the terms that you'll probably hear come more. But like, I think Juliana, your point is so important. I think it's the most. If I was to ask anybody to do anything here around sort of keeping this conversation going, it'd be just have the conversation, talk
Yeah.
about it, like, and listen to what other people have to say. Like, don't just listen
Yeah.
to yourself. Talk, why do you think that? Why, like, the
Yeah.
specific things which made me think today. And I think
Yeah.
it's like the more that we can talk about it, the more we realize actually we're not that far. Nobody is that far away from each other. I think there's, like you said, with all of this, is polarized opinions, but actually, like, we're probably all kind of in the middle somewhere. And actually, the more we can talk without like trying to find the wrong and stuff, because we're always trying like,
Exactly.
oh no, you're wrong, like this, I'm
Exactly.
right. Like, just talk and listen and try and understand. I think that's what will progress things. And I think, let's get rid of the term DEI. I think it is. I think Elon Musk has killed it. It's dead.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, right. He goes, DEI needs to die. You're like, yeah, it's done. It
so
is dead. To be
let it
honest.
die. Let it die. Let's call it
Yeah.
something different. Let's call it
Yeah.
belonging. Let's call it, inclusive businesses. Let's call it.
I mean, just fairness, like fair hiring practices, like
Exactly.
a fair and effective hiring. Like that to me, like I think that's what everyone.
Yeah.
I keep saying
Or the
that,
right
but
person for the job. you know?
Yeah. See, this is the thing. I know I keep saying it, but I do believe that like most of us want the same thing. Like, I'm not saying that there aren't people out there who are racist
Hmm.
or, homophobic or anything, right? I'm not saying that. Like, I know that there are people
Yeah.
that like have, prejudices against certain groups. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. But what I will say is, in my experience, the number of people I have talked to, I believe that like 99% of the people are not like that. I feel
Yeah.
like 99% of people, like, they care about like just everything. Like, they just want to be happy. They want to live a normal life. They want everyone else to be able to do what they want. They want, like, meaning I want my freedom, and I think other people should have their freedom too, as long as, nobody's doing wrong to
Mm.
me. I don't care what you do. Like, that is what I've heard from most people. And I'm not
Mm.
saying this from a place of I've talked to 10 people. Like, I literally, the whole reason I started this podcast is because I've been driving for Uber for over a
Yeah, of
decade.
course.
I've had a revolving door of people in my car. And you can tell I'm not just somebody who just sits there and doesn't talk. I
Yeah.
have conversations with a lot of people. And like, in my experience, 99% of people, they all just kind of want the same thing. They want to
Yeah.
be happy. They want their freedom, and they just don't want other people's freedoms to infringe on theirs. And
Mm.
ultimately, in this scenario, like, I do believe that that is what people want. Like, they
Mm.
just want hiring to be fair, right? Because the people, in my opinion, the people who are against DEI, what it sounds like is they're like, well, now it feels unfair in the other direction,
Mm.
right? And then, because the whole reason why it started is because it was unfair to these people in these categories.
Yeah.
But then now they're like, well, now it's unfair to us. And so ultimately, what is everyone fighting for?
Yeah.
Fairness. They
Fairness.
just want it to be fair.
Yeah, I
Right. So
agree.
they're all fighting for the same thing. And ultimately, see, this is what drives me nuts, is that now everyone's on on both, like, the crazy sides of this issue, instead of realizing everybody just wants the same thing.
Yeah, and I think, everyone can win. I think, starting places for people are different. Not everyone had the same lift up, and not
Yeah.
everyone, has the same, starting places are different for people. But
Yeah.
I think, to your point, like, if they could all marry up and we could all be coming from the same place, then yeah, fairness is it. And I think it is hard, because it seems like this pendulum is swinging from sort of one end to the other. So yeah, let's have conversations, let's
Yeah.
educate people, remove bias. Like, what you think about somebody, just have that conversation with them, get to know them, get to just see them beyond what you see in front of you.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. Just the bias, people have these like very learned, historic biases in them, and I think the more we can try and just be conscious of those in ourselves, the better.
Charlotte, I really appreciate you coming on. I feel like we had such a great
Yeah,
conversation.
it's great. It's funny. I didn't know where it was going to go, but it
Yeah.
went to all such good places. Thank you.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Seriously, I really do appreciate you coming on. If anyone listening wants to connect with you, or maybe have you, consult with their company or whatever you might offer, if you have anything else you want to share about what you're offering, please feel free to share that, but also just how people can connect with you.
Yeah, of course. So the company's called Inclusive People. It's myself and my business partner. We generally working with tech and video games companies, some IT companies, so sort of the tech space, which has been great. We've both got a lot of history in the video games industry, which is great. So if you want any support, guidance, you want to have a great conversation on inclusion, we're very happy to do that. Go to our website. So it's www.inclusivepeopleltd.com, or find me at Charlotte Bidgood on LinkedIn. So you can find me there and connect with me there. I'd love to speak to you.
Amazing. Thanks again, Charlotte. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Yeah, have a good one. Thanks for being here. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review or share it with someone who'd appreciate it. For everything I have to offer, visit howtobeaperson.co.